So you have been drafted into the American Civil War. $13 a month, 3 years, a wool coat, a musket, hardtack, a flag with your county's name stitched across it. Every man on your street got the same envelope. That is the picture. Here is the counter it was handed across. Congress had already written the other price into statute, $300 payable once, and you go home. The same Congress, the same year, paid a new recruit $300 to walk in. Neither government kept a line in its books for what all this would still be costing a generation after the last shot. The wording of that first number is worth hearing exactly as it was printed. A drafted man may pay to such person as the Secretary of War may authorize to receive at such sum not exceeding $300. Flat. Administrative. A ceiling set by law, good for one call, and then expired. Somebody sat in a committee room and decided where that ceiling should sit. 700 miles south, the same problem got a different answer. The Confederate Act of October 1862 exempted one white man from conscription for every 20 enslaved people held on a plantation. Not a backroom arrangement. A clause in a statute with a threshold in it. In May of 1863, an amendment attached a processing fee of $500 to the application, which tells you what kind of thing it had become by then. A form, a clerk, a queue, a receipt, a filing cabinet somewhere in Richmond with your exemption in it. Hold that beside one other figure. Across the war, taxation raised 8.2% of Confederate government revenue. 8.2. A government able to walk onto a plantation, count the people standing in the field, and name which white man stayed home, and that same government could not walk onto the same plantation and collect money. It had the reach. It did not have the machinery. Both of those things were true at once, in the same country, in the same season. Each treasury kept close accounts of what the fighting cost while it was going on. Requisitions, muster rolls, forage returns, bushels of corn signed for at a depot door. Neither set of books contains a line for what came afterwards. Here is the one piece of it that was written down at the time. The Federal Pension Act of July 1862 set $8 a month for a completely disabled private. $8 a month, for life, to a man who came home without a leg. Write that promise in 1862, and it costs the Treasury nothing at all, because almost nobody has claimed it yet. The largest number in this story is what that promise turned into. It is not in any wartime account. It belongs to a year when every man in this script had already gone home or been buried, and it was still being paid out of the same treasury. You get it at the end. Put it here, ahead of the rest of the accounts, and it would look small. Start with what the statute actually put on sale. A draft notice does not sell you an exemption from the war. It sells you another man, and it caps his price at $300 for one call. That is the whole product. Everything else. The enrolling officer with his book, the wheel of names in the district office, the surgeon's table where you strip to the waist and were measured, is delivery mechanism. The wheel turned in 1863, and 292,441 names came out of it. Now, here is the part that surprises almost everyone about a conscription law. It barely conscripted. About 52,000 of the men whose names came out paid the money and went home. Another 26,000 handed over a substitute, a real person, produced in the flesh, examined and sworn in your place. And of every name drawn that year, 9,811 men ended up in the ranks themselves. An acceptable substitute had to be produced. Not named on a form, produced, brought to the district office in person, stripped, measured, his teeth looked at, sworn in front of the same officer who had just called your name out, and then walked away with him. If he deserted that night, you stayed discharged. What the statute sold you was release from the obligation, not any interest in what happened to the man who took it on. Think about what that means standing in the room. The clerk reads your name. You have perhaps 10 days. You can find $300, or you can find a man, or you can go. 3 doors, and the first 2 are priced. Which of them is open to you was settled long before the clerk read your name, by whether there was money in a drawer at home, and how much. The law was never a net for catching soldiers. It was a machine for publishing a price per man and letting the market clear at it. Every drafted man in the North became, on the morning his name came out, a small purchaser of labor operating under a legal ceiling. Most of them bought. The paperwork is enormous, and it is almost entirely commercial. Receipts, brokers' advertisements, bank drafts, mortgages raised against a farm to keep a son off a muster roll. None of that is corruption. All of it is the statute working exactly as written. And the receipt a man carried home was dated. The wheel in the district office was going to turn again the following year, with the same names in it, so what $300 bought was not safety. It was one turn. Now walk round and stand on the other side of the same counter. The government was not only selling exemptions, it was buying men, in a market it had helped make, against every state, county, and town doing the same thing on the same afternoon. From October 1863, the federal bounty for a new 3-year recruit was $300, paid out in installments, so he could not take it and vanish on the first night. Here is where it gets strange. That is the same figure the government charged a man to stay out. $300 to leave. $300 to arrive. One Congress, 1 year, one number pointing in both directions at once. And if you were sitting in a recruiting office in the winter of 1863, you could watch both transactions happen at the same desk. Against that, look at what the number was buying. A Union private's pay, after August 1861, was $13 a month. A man in the United States colored troops was paid $10 a month, and $3 of it was taken straight back for clothing, a deduction the white private beside him never had, and one that did not end until September of 1864. Same uniform, same mud, same rifle drill, taught by the same sergeant. So the door had a published price, and the room behind it had a published wage, and the two numbers were set by the same body in the same building. Then, in July 1864, Congress repealed commutation, and the ceiling came off. That is the moment the whole thing stops being administrative. With the fixed exit closed, the only way out was to find a man and outbid every other frightened household in the district for him. The open price of a substitute ran from $300 up past $1,000 per man. Brokers advertised in the newspapers. Agents met trains. Men were shipped between districts to be sold into regiments that had never heard of them. Nothing in the statute changed except the removal of a cap. That was enough. And the thing to notice is that the cap had not been protecting the poor. It had been protecting the price. While $300 was the legal exit, nobody had to pay more than $300. So the man with modest savings and the man with a mill queued at the same window. Take the ceiling away, and the two of them stop being in the same market at all. Turn from the one-off prices to the bills that arrive every year, and the two governments stop resembling each other. Take the Confederate Treasury first, and think of it as a household that pays every bill by writing a note the neighbors are not allowed to refuse. Not a loan, not a coin, a printed promise, legal tender by decree, handed across the counter for boots and beef and rail iron. Note issue raised 60% of Confederate government revenue. That is the recurring income. The recurring obligation went the other way, and it did not come in paper at all. The Tax Act of the 24th of April 1863 took 1/10 of every farm's produce in kind every year. Not 1/10 of the profit. 1/10 of the corn, the bacon, the fodder, the sweet potatoes, weighed at the barn and hauled to a government depot by the farmer, at the farmer's own expense, behind the farmer's own mule. A tax you pay in wagons is a very different obligation from a tax you pay in money. It cannot be deferred, it cannot be borrowed against, and it arrives at exactly the season you would rather be selling. Now, here is the number that ends the argument about King Cotton. Import duties brought the Confederate Treasury $3.5 million across all 4 years of fighting. Not per year. That is the whole customs revenue of a country whose entire case for existing was that the world could not do without what it shipped out. The United States kept its books the ordinary way. Federal outlays for the year ending June 1861 were $80.2 million. For the year ending June 1865, the War and Navy departments alone spent $1,170 million, and $1,170 million, divided over 365 days, is $3.2 million a day. $3.2 million a day, every day, including Sundays, including the days nothing happened. That was paid for 3 ways at once, and the mix is the point. An income tax from July 1862 charging 3% on incomes between $600,000 and $10,000 a year. $450 million of greenbacks pushed into circulation by the end of the war, and borrowing that carried the federal debt from $65 million in 1861 to $2,700 million by 1865. Look at what that third line actually is. On those two figures, the Union owed 41 times what it had owed 4 years earlier, and it was the healthiest thing on the page, because a debt is an obligation somebody has agreed to carry, at a rate, on a date. Notes that nobody will take are not an obligation. They are a queue at a shop counter that gets longer every morning. The South began the war, holding the most valuable crop on earth, and then spent 2 years making itself poorer with it deliberately. The 1860 United States cotton crop came to 4,861,292 bales. Bales, not tons, a compressed block, iron-banded, stenciled with a factor's mark, stacked 6 high on a levee at New Orleans and Mobile and Charleston until the wharf timbers complained. That cotton sold in New York at 10 3/4 cents a pound. Then the committees started burning it. Planters, vigilance committees, and state conventions destroyed an estimated 2.5 million bales on purpose to force a shortage on the Lancashire mills and buy British recognition with the pain. Nobody kept a central register of the burnings, so that figure is an estimate, and I am going to keep calling it one. Here is the part that should have been obvious in 1861. The shortage worked. By 1864, the same middling upland cotton was fetching 68 cents a pound in New York, in a market the South had cut itself off from. The scarcity was manufactured by the people who grew it, and the price it produced was collected by everybody except them. Egyptian growers took it. Indian growers took it. Northern traders creeping through the lines and buying bales in Memphis took it. Take a little off that rise before you use it, though. The 1864 quote is in greenbacks, which had lost ground against gold, so part of the climb is the money and not the cotton. Not all of it. Not nearly all of it. But some, and you should know that before you repeat the number. The same trick was being played with money, and it failed the same way. Between January 1861 and October 1864, the Confederate money stock multiplied 11.5 times. Over the same window, prices in the eastern Confederate cities multiplied 28 times. Put those two beside each other. The government printed 11.5 times as much money, and the goods it was chasing got 28 times dearer. Printing more did not summon more corn out of a Georgia field. It moved the same corn to whoever spent fastest, which meant the soldier paid in arrears at a depot 400 miles from a shop was structurally last in every queue in the country. The winning side felt a milder version of exactly the same thing. On a base of 100 in 1860, Union consumer prices stood at 175 by the end of 1865. Over the same 4 years, the Union real wage index fell to 82. The men who stayed home, built the rifles, rolled the rail, filled the contracts, and read about victories in the evening paper ended the war measurably poorer than they started it. Nobody burned anything in Pennsylvania. It happened anyway. Take all of it down to one man, and then multiply back up. A Union private earned $13 a month. The statutory ceiling on buying your way out of a draft call was $300. So the exit was priced at 300 divided by 13, 23 months of a soldier's pay. 23 months, nearly 2 years of a private's wages, payable in a single afternoon, in cash, by a man whose entire point was that he was never going to earn a private's wage. That is the sentence to hold on to. The price of not being a soldier was set in units of soldier. Now multiply. Across every Union draft call before the repeal, 86,724 men paid it. At the ceiling, 86,724 times 300 is $26,017,200, collected by the United States Treasury, from its own citizens, in exchange for nothing but their absence. Notice what that money was not. It was not a fine because nothing had been done wrong, nor was it a tax because it fell only on the unlucky. What it was a fee for a service the government was uniquely placed to sell, the right to be left alone. And now put the same arithmetic on a man who had no way out at all. A private in the United States Colored Troops drew $10 a month with 3 taken back for clothing. $7 per man per month in hand. $7 against the 13 the white private beside him was drawing for the same drill, the same rations, the same ditch. That gap is not incidental to this arithmetic. It is the arithmetic. Because for him the same exit came to 300 divided by 7, 43 months of pay, 43 months, 3.5 years of wages to buy out of a 3-year enlistment. The door had a single published price on it, and a man's ability to reach the handle depended entirely on what the same government had already decided he was worth per month. Run it once more from the other end, and it gets worse rather than better. $26 million came in from men buying their way out. That same treasury was getting through $3.2 million a day by 1865. So every dollar of commutation money ever collected, from every district in the North, across 2 years of drawing names, came to 8 days. 8 days of war. That is what the entire buyout market bought the United States government. 8 days of powder, forage, boots, rail freight, and wages. The number that ruined a family's savings, that decided which brother went and which stayed, that put mobs into the streets of New York, measured against the thing it was supposedly funding. It was 8 days. Richmond, 1864, and the collapse arrives as a price list nailed to a wall. The Confederate government's own ceiling for a barrel of superfine flour stood at $25 in January of that year. 6 months later, the same official ceiling was $150. That is the controlled price. The one merchants were ordered not to exceed, and routinely did, because a schedule printed in Richmond does not put flour in a barrel in a mill on the Chickahominy. The government had discovered what every government discovers at this point. You can set a number, and the number will be obeyed by exactly the people who have nothing to sell. Here is what that meant to the man the war was actually being fought by. A Confederate private was paid $11 a month, and it had not moved since 1861. So 1 barrel of flour at the government's own capped price cost him 13.6 months of pay. Over a year of soldiering for 1 barrel of flour. And he was not buying flour on a battlefield in Virginia, so the number is not a grocery bill. It is a measurement of what his pay had become. He was defending a currency that could no longer buy him bread. You can watch it break in the faces of the people who had to hold the paper. Clerks paid monthly in notes that lost value between payday and the shop. Farmers who would take corn for corn but not paper for corn. Women in the streets of Richmond in the spring of 1863 breaking into the shops because the price of feeding a family had come loose from any wage anybody was earning. And then the last step, which is very quick. By April 1865, a Confederate dollar was worth 1 6/10 of a cent in United States money. 1 6/10. Not because a battle was lost that week. The currency had been sliding for 2 years. Because a note is a promise, and a promise is only worth the number of people who still believe the thing that made it will exist next year. The Confederacy did not run out of paper. It never ran out of paper. It ran out of anybody willing to take the paper, which is the same event arriving from a different direction, and it arrived months before the surrender at Appomattox rather than after it. That is the thing about a currency printed to fight a war. It stops working when the war is lost, and it stops working before anybody announces that the war is lost. Now put the 2 columns side by side, in one money, and read the whole account at once. Everything that follows is in $1860, the money as it stood before any of this started. That is how the economic historians reckoned it up afterwards. It is also the honest way to do it, because converting a Civil War figure into today's money tells you nothing except how confident the person doing the converting is. Stay inside the period and the numbers keep their meaning. 3 lines. Government spending, both sides, everything both treasuries actually laid out. $3,334 million. Physical destruction, burned barns, torn track, wrecked bridges, ruined mills, almost every dollar of it in the South. $1,487 million. And the earnings the dead and the maimed would have made if they had come home whole, counted as the loss it is. $1,831 million. Add them up. $6,652 million of direct cost, before a single indirect consequence is counted, before the lost trade, the lost decades, the interest, the pensions. Now divide it over the people who live there, because a national total is a number nobody ever paid, and a per-head figure is a number somebody did. In the South, $376 a head. Up north, $148 a head. Same war, same 4 years, and the spread, $228 a head, is the price of losing on top of the price of fighting, carried not by an army or a government but by every person in the 11 states, including the ones born in 1864 who would spend their childhood inside that hole. A per-head figure has that property. It does not care whether you volunteered, whether you owned anything, whether you were for it or against it, or whether you were 4 years old when it ended. Here is the figure that makes the whole account look like a mistake. Every enslaved person in the United States in 1860, about 4 million people, was valued in the market at some $3,000 million altogether. Read those 2 numbers next to each other. The market value of the entire institution, $3,000 million. The direct cost of the war fought over it, $6,652 million. The war cost more than twice what the thing itself was priced at. and that is before you count what it did to the people who were the property in that valuation, which no ledger on earth was built to hold. I am not going to pretend that comparison is a policy proposal. Nobody in 1860 was offering to write that check, and the men who owned that property were not selling at any price, which is precisely why the arithmetic came out the way it did. But it is the comparison the numbers make on their own, and it sits there in the table whether anyone likes it or not. Go back to the $8 a month the Pension Act promised a completely disabled private in 1862. $8, written when almost nobody had claimed it, in a Congress that had every reason to be generous with a bill it would not be presented for years. Then the men came home, and kept coming home, and the claims arrived, and the widows' claims arrived behind them, and Congress kept widening who qualified, because there is no vote in telling a veteran he is not eligible. By 1893, the payments on that promise and everything stacked on top of it were taking more than 40% of all federal revenue, with over 1 million men on the rolls. 40%. Not of the war budget. Of everything the United States government collected, in a year with no war in it 28 years after the last shot, paid by clerks who had never seen a battlefield to men whose officers were dead. That is the largest number in this story, and it is the one nobody wrote down at the time, because at the time it was a sentence in a statute rather than a figure in a column. A pension roll is not a memorial. It is the last page of an account nobody had finished reading. And go back one more step to the number at the top of that account, $300. The sum of Congress set in plain language, in a statute anybody could buy a copy of for one man's absence from one draft call. That is where this started. A wool coat, a musket, hardtack, a flag with your county's name on it, and an envelope on the table with your name in a clerk's handwriting. And next to all of it, a published price for making the envelope go away. Everything after it is that figure with the interest attached, the bounty that matched it, the substitute market that outgrew it, the $26 million it collected, and the 8 days of war that bought, the barrel of flour in Richmond that no Confederate private's pay could reach, the $6,652 million of direct cost, the $376 a head, and the 40% of a federal budget still being paid out in 1893. Wars are usually described in the language of what people were willing to die for. The paperwork is in the other language entirely. Both governments wrote down, in public, in statute, exactly what a man was worth to them, and then spent 30 years discovering they had got the number wrong.